And the fact is that they were all investigated forensically, and you probably remember, but the forensic examination at the time was probably the most sophisticated in the world, and found with no case to answer by the coroner's courts. But that doesn't seem to have stopped the persecution of our soldiers. And the British public have got to really choose whether they want the capability of the SAS, because it's going to be eroded if people think that they're going to be hounded for 20 years
So how do you
if
stop?
they
So
sign up.
in the Conservative leadership campaign, Robert Jenrick said that SAS soldiers had been forced to kill rather than capture terrorists because of concerns they would end up being freed by the European Court of Human Rights. His comments were widely condemned as irresponsible. But the Times understands that an RAF drone was used to kill an Islamic State engineer because Special Forces were not able to detain him under human rights law. Jamie Lowther Pinkerton was a squadron commander of 22 SAS from 1991 to 94, and we can speak to him now. Jamie, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Do you find this plausible, what's in the Times today, that a drone could be used to kill an Islamic State engineer for that particular reason?
Well, I mean, what I would say about it is that there would be no change in the rules of engagement for SAS personnel. So they would be sent to apprehend rather than sort of kill in some sort of assassination type way. But if the law would prevent them being able to do that within the law, then there may be no alternative. But I need to sort of stress from the outset here that my involvement is really about my own soldiers. I left the SAS, 30 years ago, and it's really I've sort of broken cover because I want to talk really about the people that I knew back then and what I know about, and I'm not really read in at all to the Afghanistan situation.
Well, let's talk about the issue generally, because it's interesting. British armed forces, as you say, need to follow the law. They need to conduct themselves in a morally appropriate way, when
Yeah.
even in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, which everyone would acknowledge. Is it right that there are laws and that they are human rights laws that are required to be followed even on a battlefield, even in extremis?
There have to be laws, and the whole credibility of what we did it back in the day was based on the fact that we operated within the law. Because if you don't, you just descend to the level of the terrorist and you lose the moral high ground, apart from the purest moral point of it. So I think there have to be laws. I think where we've gone astray is trying to apply laws that were perfectly legitimately drawn up in the wake of the Second World War to prevent the sort of state persecution of individuals, which was the ECHR back in the day, and the requirement for laws which will be workable with counter-terrorism, where you're not operating against a state, and in a way the roles are reversed, where you are being sent out as state actors, but as individuals onto a battlefield at night or wherever it may be, to apprehend terrorists who do not operate within the law. So can you see the distinction?
I can see the distinction. I guess that I'm interested in the practical thing that follows from that, which is, should special forces therefore not be prosecuted, in your view, should be exempt from prosecution under those laws, the ECHR laws that we're talking about?
Yes, I think the ECHR Article 2, which is the right to life, the people who wrote the ECHR realized this because they lived through the Second World War, and they put in that derogation article, which is number 15, which said that the Article 2 would be derogated in case in the context of war and national emergency, which Northern Ireland very clearly fell within.
So can that be done? I guess the question is, can that be done within the existing legislation? Does anything need to change, or does there need to be some sort of formal recognition that certain types of soldiers serving in certain types of conditions should not be prosecuted? Because there are prosecutions, and your old lot, the SAS, and you talk about Northern Ireland, they're often in fear of being prosecuted. Does someone need to say there's a line in the sand here, you can't be prosecuted?
No, absolutely not, Steve, because you then revert, if you derogate Article 2, you then revert to the law of armed conflict and the Geneva Conventions, which governed all of our operations prior to the human rights law being taken onto the British statute books. So that there's no free pass here, and we wouldn't want that. What I would say, going back to your point about the abstract sort of debate about ECHR, and the pressure that puts on the individual when they're sent out into the night to try and apprehend highly armed people, and that's why the SAS are used. They're sent out to apprehend, but they need to be able to protect innocent people and themselves should the need arise. And there's a difference between this abstract debate and actually somebody trying to put 30 rounds from a magazine into you in the middle of the night.
So is your answer that we should come out of the ECHR? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't say that at all. I just say it needs to be applied properly because at the moment, my old soldiers have been hounded now for 20 years, retrospectively applying Article 2 to a situation which was clearly in need of derogation and was indeed back in the day. And the fact is that they were all investigated forensically. And you probably remember, but the forensic examination at the time was probably the most sophisticated in the world and found with no case to answer by the coroner's courts. But that doesn't seem to have stopped the persecution of our soldiers. And the British public have got to really choose whether they want the capability of the SAS, because it's going to be eroded if people think that they're going to be hounded for 20 years.
So how do you stop?
So
be clear, because Robert Jenrick mentioned this, to go back to the beginning, say that as a reason for coming out of the ECHR. What do you want to see someone do? What's the actual action here? Is it to say there's just to decline to prosecute? Is that the answer?
No, what we're asking is for the government to review the current situation where soldiers are being subpoenaed sometimes for the third or fourth time and dragged back to inquests in Northern Ireland and going over the same old ground. I mean, very aggressively. So some of my soldiers from the old days, have been hauled back sort of in the last 2 years and screamed and shouted at over the same things which they were effectively exonerated from any blame for back in the day, soon after the event.
Just finally, though, I get the counter-argument to this, which I know you will have wrestled with yourself, is there will have been occasions, there have been occasions, if you look back in the history of British military, where people have acted improperly, where the power that we've vested in these soldiers, even in extremis, has been misused to the cost of civilian life without proper due attention or care being paid for that civilian life. That has happened in military history. There's got to be a balance between allowing soldiers freedom to fight the fight they need to fight to keep us safe, but also that freedom not being abused by people who don't care about the moral effect of what they're doing. And how you strike a line between that is not that easy, I suspect. No,
and you've hit the nail on the head. It is a balance. But let me be clear and just repeat the point I made at the beginning, Stig. There are no greater supporters than the serving SAS soldiers for the full application of the law when it comes to them operating within the law. Otherwise, our credibility is blown.
Yeah, and that's an important thing for everyone to have. Jamie, good to speak to you. We'll see how this plays out. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Sue.
That's Jamie Lowther Pinkerton here, who's Squadron Commander of 22 SAS from 91 to 94, talking about what happened in Northern Ireland. But it's a pressing issue because you remember Robert Jenrick talked about coming out of the ECHR relatively recently, and that's clearly an issue that's not going to go away. A few of us in the West regret the destruction of ISIS, the brutal group that terrorised parts of Syria and Iraq for 5 years. But the Times has learned a bit more about how it was done. An RAF Reaper drone was used to kill an Islamic State biological weapons engineer. The military had ruled out using the SAS to capture him because they thought human rights law would have led to his release. This seems to back up something Robert Jenrick said during the Tory leadership contest, that the SAS were forced to kill rather than capture terrorists because the European court would set them free. Andrew, I guess the question is, what level of law-abiding approach should there be for soldiers attempting to stop terrorists? Should they have to follow human rights legislation, which has encoded into it a respect for life, or are there some occasions where that should be put to one side? And if so, how do you trust the soldiers to act in a morally appropriate way? How much rules should there be on the battlefield, I suppose this boils down to?
It does make me wonder whether rules, codified laws, can actually work on the battlefield. We talk about the fog of war, and that's often about we don't know what's happening. But morality must be so fogged in those circumstances. Anyway, I remember my old editor, Max Hastings, the great military historian, saying that wars are won by people following the rules, getting up, doing their duty, going back to bed, by ordinary people, and that's how wars are won. But they're also won a little bit by the maniacs, the people who go over the top, the people who start shooting wildly. They're never properly acknowledged. or they become mythologized as heroes. They're probably terrible people, probably the people you don't want to run into on Saturday night in a street full of pubs. And it's all comes out on that mentality is seen on that rather splendid but one phrase fanciful drama SAS Rogue Heroes,
Yeah.
where these berserk guys, they weren't following even the Geneva Convention, let alone the European Convention on Human Rights. What I would like, soldiers and possibly doctors and journalists, is to have a proper ethical mindset that is drilled into them from their first day of duty or service or
And they say they
employment.
might actually get that, but it's interesting. I mean, war crimes have been going on with every army, every military since the beginning of war. I mean, Dresden was a war crime, even though we were fighting against people in the Second World War who were committing far worse crimes. It still was a breach of the conventions. But because Britain won, it was never really litigated in any form or another. I guess this boils down to, Laura, should soldiers be prosecuted in the same way as citizens? So if you kill a terrorist, should that conduct be examined in the same way, using the same laws, or is there something fundamentally morally different between between that and putting yourself in harm's way and trying to do the right thing for your country?
So human rights law exists for wars. It doesn't exist for when everything is lovely. And the human rights laws that exist around wars are vital. And we're seeing it in the Middle East. We're seeing it in Israel-Palestine, where people should be held into account on both sides for what is happening. So I do not agree that you think wars should be won by maniacs or whatever the term you used. Actually, I think soldiers should, as you say, be trained in the ethics of war. And it is that training that gives you your reaction. You do not get a free pass. And one of the interesting things that happened in Israel after the Holocaust is that it is against the law in Israel to say, as a soldier, I am doing this, which my officer told me, because I am only carrying out orders. No, you have a moral duty with how you act, and you need to be held into account as a soldier, because you have a hell of a lot more capacity for destruction than you do when you are not, when you're in civilians.
Yeah. The fear from soldiers, though, we heard this from Nick Lowther Pinkerton, is that will they get a fair go? And if they commit their life to soldiering, and then they get, after the event, years and years of people coming after them, they regard that sometimes as unfair. But is that the price you pay for living in a codified society?
Yes. That's the price you pay for upholding international law and having some form of holding what is becoming increasingly difficult to hold. So yes, and if the law is wrong, then internationally we need to change that law. But those laws give us stability against chaos.